Lost in Time, Early Alabama Indians. Archaic and woodland Indians, New Technologies. When the ancient hunters first came to Alabama, North America was locked in an Ice Age grip. But the glaciers began their retreat around 11,000 BC, and over the next 3 millennia, that world would die and be reborn in a different shape and form. The sea level rose, grassland became forest, and the huge Ice Age mammals vanished, prey to extinction. With the foundation of his survival crumbling, man was left to adapt or die. In the southeast, where the impact of the Ice Age had been less dramatic, man had already begun his adaptation to the present-day climate and environment. His culture underwent a gradual and continuous change into a form archaeologists call the Archaic. During this period, Indian bands became larger and more settled, and they began to discover new ways of using the natural bounty around them. People have always gathered edible plants, but as the great beasts of the Ice Age died away, the ancient hunters became harvesters as well. An elephant or a mammoth might furnish food for a week. A rabbit is barely a meal. But the eastern woodlands and streams yielded an ample supply of vegetable foods and shellfish, which provided a stable base for the Indian diet. The hunt continued, but Indians became increasingly efficient gatherers of the natural harvest. One way we know of this development is the appearance of plant processing equipment in excavations of archaic sites. Mortars, grinders, stone bowls, ground stone axes, and other tools of bone and shell. Remains of the plants themselves have also been uncovered. Acorns, mulberries, hickory nuts, chestnuts, and squash, sunflowers, persimmons, and walnuts. This abundance of plant food did not alter the need to hunt, but the large, lumbering Ice Age beasts were replaced by the swift, shy animals of the forest. And so the tactics of the hunt changed. Hunting bands continued to seek out game, but gone were the team efforts to subdue large animals. In their place was the solitary hunter, stalking his prey in the forest. The simple spear was no longer the Indian's only weapon. It was a part of a small but effective arsenal which contained nets, traps, and a new weapon, the atlatl. Called by its Aztec name, this device added a lever to the simple spear mechanism, intensifying its killing power. Great strength was no longer required to make a fatal wound, and hunting was no longer restricted to those of superior physical ability. Thus, the atlatl made it possible for more Indians to join the hunt, and its yield increased. Since most of the atlatl was made from wood, few of the original weapons have survived decay, but the distinctive bone hook and the mysterious banner stone clue archaeologists to the use of this device. Dr. Craig T. Sheldon, Auburn University at Montgomery.
The atlatl weight or banner stone is a good example of how archaeological field techniques can help us to understand the past. When originally found in the 19th century, these perforated stone objects were called banner stones because they were thought to have been mounted on the ends of wooden shafts or sticks and used as weapons. They actually knew very little about them because these objects were simply found either on the surface or dug up indiscriminately from Indian sites in the southeast. Then, in the 1930s, modern archaeological field techniques began to be used, and our understanding of archaeological objects began to improve. The purpose of archaeological field techniques is not simply to recover objects, such as a banner stone or atlatl weight, but it's to recover the objects in such a way that we know the maximal amount of information about the people who made and used and discarded these artifacts. The way we maximize information about objects and so forth is to very carefully excavate in squares, level by level, very carefully recording them. This is called excavating in context, and what we're attempting to do is show how the objects rest in relation to other objects within the site. Here's a very excellent example of how excavation in context can help us to understand something. Here is one of the so-called banner stones, and it is in close proximity to a antler atlatl hook or spear thrower hook. By very carefully brushing away the dirt, we were able to see this dark line of discoloration, which probably represents a decayed wooden shaft which ran through the hole in the stone and into the socket on the hook. The interpretation of this object now is that it is an atlatl, and the weight served in some way to improve the efficiency of this device. We're not certain exactly how.
The purpose of the atlatl weight is something of a mystery, but whether it had a practical use or was just a charm or talisman, man once placed great importance on it. Clearly, many hours of labor were devoted to its construction. Craftsmen sculpted the stone with a combination of techniques. First, it was pecked, literally battered into shape with another harder stone. Then it was drilled. To provide a vise to hold the weight during drilling, a wedge was driven into a log, opening a small crack. The weight was then placed in the crack and the wedge removed. With the weight held tightly in place, a hole was bored through the widest part of the stone. The end of a small section of hollow reed was dampened and dipped in sand. Then, placing the reed on the weight, the craftsman would rub his hands together swiftly, boring the abrasive sand crystals into the rock. The result was a smooth, straight hole through solid rock, a task that is difficult to accomplish today. Mastery of these basic stoneworking techniques enabled the manufacture of a variety of tools from a range of materials. Craftsmen split bone, ground the pieces on a sandstone block, and made the needles and awls used to work hide and plant fiber. In much the same way, splitting and grinding, the toe bone of a deer became a fishhook. Shells were ground and drilled for beads and other ornaments which became necklaces and pendants. And varieties of dense stones, such as granite, were shaped by pecking and grinding to become mullers, axes, bowls, and even pipes. In the southeast, spring brings an end to the winter rains. And as the weather turns warm and mild, the land gives birth to a variety of life. By May, the river levels have dropped, allowing the easy collection of shellfish. And in response to this pulse in the natural cycle, man moved down from the bluff shelters and caves that were his winter refuge. In the bottomlands, he made camp where river shoal waters yielded a harvest of shellfish. A base camp was pitched, simple huts were put up, and cooking pits dug. Men would hunt and fish, women cooked and tended, and the young and the aged would gather. Freshwater clams, mussels, and snails were collected by the ton, probably in baskets. Tossed on the fires to steam, the mussels were shared by several cooperating bands. These bands might have wintered separately, but on the shell mounds they worked together, sharing stone and other resources brought from the uplands, foraging the countryside for other diet staples. After the lean, isolating winter months, it was a time of plenty and an important social event. Friendships were renewed, ceremonies of passage conducted, and marriages contracted. Today, these sites, littered by bits of discarded shell, can be found along many of Alabama's rivers. Where man once followed the hunt, he now followed the seasons, waiting for that pulse in the natural cycle which would dictate another move. Even as autumn spread its colorful canopy, the rains came. Rising river levels made the collection of shellfish impossible. So man abandoned the bottomlands, seeking shelter among the limestone and sandstone formations of higher ground. Bluff shelters and caves became his home through the fall and winter. He hunted deer, turkey, and squirrel, gathered nuts, and packed his storage pits against the coming frosts. Hickory nuts and walnuts could be eaten right out of the shell. Chestnuts were often roasted. But acorns contain a large amount of tannic acid and are virtually inedible in natural form. To make them more palatable, the Indians first ground the acorns into a meal. The acid was then removed or leached by repeatedly pouring boiling water through the meal. The most difficult part of this process was boiling the water. The heavy, awkward bowls of sandstone or steatite were not usable for boiling. Sandstone shatters in direct heat, while steatite is fragile and difficult to find. The Indians therefore developed a technique of first heating rocks and then placing them in a water-filled container. The water is instantly brought to a boil, and the container is left undamaged. This procedure is laborious, but it gave man the ability to process a wider range of foods, adding new sources of protein and carbohydrate to the diet. This newfound abundance of foods, coupled with an ever-growing proficiency at storage, stabilized the food supply. Man no longer relied solely on the hunt for food. Consequently, he began to limit his movement to a twice-yearly migration: the bottomlands in the spring, the upland in the fall. Over the 7,000 years of the archaic tradition, man had successfully adapted to his environment. But he was forced to live within the limits not of that environment, but of his ability to exploit it. The limit was technological. Man did not have the tools to process all the food around him. A development of tremendous significance changed that situation: pottery. The technique of pottery making was developed separately in many areas of the world. Most likely it was introduced in the Southeast by cultural diffusion, the slow spread of ideas from one group of people to another. Although the Southeast has an abundance of clay-type soil, pure clay is not easily worked. It can be an infuriating combination of sticky and slippery. It doesn't dry thoroughly or evenly, and pockets of moisture can cause it to shatter when fired. To remedy this situation, another substance called a tempering agent is added. The first southeastern potters used plant fiber as the tempering agent. This allowed the pot to dry more evenly and reduce breakage during firing. Then, pulling, pinching, pushing, they shaped their pots and bowls. Later, potters mixed their clay with sand, grit, crushed rock, and finally grog, crushed pottery. The mixture produced a strong, durable ceramic. They also developed a technique of making pottery by coiling long ropes of tempered clay. This made the process even faster and more efficient. Instead of days of laborious pecking and grinding to produce stone bowls, young women and children turned shapeless lumps of earth into designs of function and beauty. Pottery was a boon to the early Indians. With a fireproof, decay-resistant, watertight vessel, food could be quickly prepared and easily stored. To a society whose fundamental economic currency was food, pottery meant stability and growth. For the first time, man could process and store more than nature unaided could furnish, and he began to farm. His early efforts were simple. Natural stands of edible plants were hoed and weeded, and after several seasons of care, the density and yield of these stands gradually increased. Eventually, seeds were saved, ensuring next year's harvest. With this ability to plan, the food supply became more stable, allowing a permanence to settlement. Hunters still roamed the forest for game, and gathering parties worked the shoal waters, but a change of season no longer forced a migration. By 1000 BC, man had begun to settle down in small villages. The new lifestyle, based on simple farming, hunting, and an intensive gathering, is called the woodland tradition. There were several technological developments around this time, including the bow and arrow, and a kind of rudimentary loom. The social structure was changing too. At first, the leadership of these societies fell to the most able, the strongest, the best hunter, the best farmer. But as man became more sedentary, he had to trade with other groups to get the raw materials he needed. New leaders emerged who could organize this economic activity. And differences in status and prestige, rank, developed as people found that they derived power and influence from association with the leader. We know of this distinction between common and elite because of the sometimes striking differences in burial treatment. Some interments are simple and contain few, if any, grave goods, a stone point or some pieces of worked bone. Others are quite elaborate, marked by small rounded earthen mounds, and accompanied by tools, charms, jewelry, pipes, pottery, and even dogs. Of the various grave goods that found their way into woodland burials, one of the most exotic is copper. The presence and use of the metal does not imply a knowledge of smelting, reducing the metal from raw ore, for southeastern Indians simply worked pure nuggets into sheets or beads. What is most interesting is that only small deposits of copper are native to the Tennessee Valley. It was probably imported from the Great Lakes, over 1,000 miles away. But long-distance travel was not unusual. Man might cover as much as 2,000 miles in a matter of weeks. Each section of the continent produced some desirable product which the others did not have. Pipestone from quarries in present-day Minnesota and Wisconsin, and steatite and mica from Appalachia have been found in Alabama. By 1000 AD, a new, more sophisticated society was developing. Drawing on the technological and social developments of century upon century of Indian life in Alabama, this new tradition would achieve a peak of elaborate cultural expression.
This program was made possible by grants from the Lynn Henley Charitable Trust and the Committee for the Humanities in Alabama, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities. An Auburn Television production.